Please be seated. I feel like I'm in church. Doesn't happen very often. Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Keeley. I'm the Provost and Vice President of Research at the University of New Brunswick. Can I be heard in the back? Welcome all. We apologize for putting on a standing room only performance, but it's delightful to see all of you here this evening. This is the introduction of the Ideas That Matter speakers series, and I think we're getting it off to a wonderful start, and this is a wonderful turnout. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first talk in this series. The series will feature researchers from the University of New Brunswick's Faculty of Arts, some of Canada's leading scholars, and they will all be speaking on topics of importance to New Brunswickers. Over the next 8 months, we will be holding 5 discussions on a wide range of subjects in the humanities and social sciences. Ideas That Matter is an integral part of UNB's commitment to create an open forum for the exchange and debate of knowledge, something that we've been doing for the past 225 years. I'm very pleased that we're partnering with the private sector to bring this series to you. The 25 organizations listed on your program have generously come on board as series patrons. I'd like to especially thank our presenting sponsor, the University of New Brunswick's Associate Alumni, and our patrons for tonight's talk, Goose Lane Editions, the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, Stuart McKelvey, and the Daily Gleaner. Thank you for your support and your interest in being part of this dialogue. The Ideas That Matter series is being held in conjunction with the University of New Brunswick's 225th anniversary celebrations and with Congress 2011, one of the largest academic gatherings in Canada, which the University of New Brunswick will be co-hosting with St. Thomas University in late May and early June this year. Together, the Congress of the Social Sciences, the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Ideas That Matter series will shine the spotlight on the social science and humanities disciplines, highlighting their impact on New Brunswick and the world. Following the presentation by tonight's featured speaker, we will have a question and answer session, so you will have the opportunity to join in this important discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our host for the evening and to thank him very much for agreeing to be host, a UNB graduate, the Honorable Braden Nicholas, a former neighbor of mine, I hasten to add, next door neighbor even, the Honorable Braden Nicholas, the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. Braden.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Keeley, or Greg, I guess, as I know him as a neighbor. Wow, what a crowd. Not to put too much pressure on you, but it's really great. So first of all, of course, my wife and I want to welcome each and every one of you to this beautiful residence government house, bienvenue la résidence du gouverneur. Voulez-vous une belle Pierre? This is the people's house, and it is a privilege for my wife and I to welcome each and every one of you here as you inaugurate this particular series, Ideas That Matter. This is a national and provincial historic site which links to all of our founding cultures. The ground considered sacred to my people and our ancestors is just a few steps away from where we are here this evening. This was also the site of the first French settlement in this area, Le Village Pointe Saint-Anne. And loyalists, of course, also were the other individuals who came and ended up building this actual residence 182 years ago. So tonight's topic, our guest speaker, the whole concept of the lecture series is appropriate to this location. It is also an honor to have top scholars from the Faculty of Arts who will bring their work to the people of New Brunswick through this series, and it is my hope that we'll see renewed discussions on each of these issues that will be discussed today. And of course, it's a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Susan Blair of the Department of Anthropology. I have known Dr. Blair, I guess, or Susan, as I like to address her, for a number of years. Of course, you all know her background, but just give a brief description of her academic background. Dr. Blair has a Bachelor of Arts from McMaster University, Master of Arts from the University of New Brunswick, and her doctorate from the University of Toronto. She started her work in archaeology in New Brunswick in the late 1980s, and since that time she has produced a very significant and respected body of work. Through her meticulous research, she has immersed herself in the pre-contact history of our region and developed knowledge and expertise critical to our understanding of ourselves. Her projects include work on the pre-contact archaeology of Grand Manan, oversight of Jemsay Crossing archaeological project, the largest archaeological project ever conducted in eastern Canada, and her continued work with the archaeological heritage of Matapanagya Mi'kmaq Nation. In her talk this evening, Dr. Blair hopes to provide us with a new way to understand ourselves and who we are as New Brunswickers, not because of where we find ourselves today, but based on the archaeological evidence of our past. So once again, I want to welcome each and every one of you, and I present you Dr. Susan Blair.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen and elders, thank you for coming out on a cold February night. Now, we need to have a green light on this machine, I think. There. And I'm going to try and stay very fixed behind this podium. For those of you who've seen me talk before, I tend to be a bit of a pacer, and that will be a real problem tonight. So I'm going to try and stay here and not launch myself in that direction. So now I'm hoping that the lights aren't too bright to see the screen. Is it dark enough to... This is very much a visual presentation, so I don't know if there's a way of lowering some of these lights or not. Is that... Okay, well, you can let me know if there's a problem seeing some of the images. So 1 year and a month ago from tonight, then Chief Noah Augustine of Matapanagya Mi'kmaq Nation gave the first part of the annual Pacey Lecture at UMB St. John. In his talk, as he did in life, he embraced ideas that matter. The research presented in this talk represents a collective, collaborative, community-driven approach, and Noah was a key part of this process. I will profoundly miss his presence in this project, as well as his drive, insight, and passion for knowledge and his community. Given that this research represents a collaboration, there are many who have been involved, and I'll mention a few of them here before continuing. The research that's part of this presentation has been generously supported by Matapanagya Heritage Park, the University of New Brunswick, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Harrison McCain Foundation. And it builds very much on the work of others, especially Joe Augustine, Madeleine Augustine, Pam Ward, Chris Turnbull, and Pat Allen. I'm also very much indebted to the enrichment of my scholarship by my graduate students and undergraduate students. I see many of them here today. And so I'd like to sort of especially thank them for the ways in which they continue to challenge me and encourage me to think broadly about the research that I'm working on. By now, you've actually seen this ghostly image that's on the screen now, or at least part of it 4 times, and I'm sure that some of you have identified what it is, although if you're like me, it may not have been an immediate recognition, and I'll make it a little darker here so you can see. What we're looking at here is the coast of eastern North America, but not in the way that we conventionally depict it. Part of what I'm trying to get at here is that there's ways in which we become accustomed to thinking, and I think these often structure the way that we understand the world around us. in some ways, these ways of looking at the world become metaphors. And just as metaphors, when you use them a lot of time, become cliched, these ways of thinking can, in some ways, lose their evocative power, their ability to evoke all the other kinds of things that we're supposed to be thinking about, and they become naturalized. We become so accustomed, for example, to thinking that fire licks at wood that we forget that tongues don't come into it at all. This is, I think, important to how we think about archaeology. Archaeology is about the understanding of human culture in time and space. While archaeological evidence is directly about places and spots, archaeological exploration tends to operate at a larger scale. What patterns we can perceive in time and space as we move from local to regional to macro-regional is an important thing to consider, and how we can weave these together into a succinct and coherent narrative. And yet, when it comes to exploring the past of the region in which we live, our understanding of space and time is not neutral. We understand it in our own terms. We don't tend to think of New Brunswick as the right side of a bumpy coastline, as we can see it here. We think of it in relation to New England or to southern Ontario, or as a place tourists think they drive through to get to Halifax. Furthermore, people from other regions tend to have the same problem. They situate this region relative to themselves and their particular view of time and space. I'm interested in this because in the broader northeastern part of North America, there is a quantity of detailed local archaeological information that is being developed into a broad synthesis for the period between 4,000 years ago and the beginning of contact between Aboriginal cultures of the Americas and Europe around 500 years ago. In part, this synthesis is being developed because in parts of eastern North America, especially the Midwest, the upper reaches of the Mississippi drainage, and in the Great Lake Basin, there's now over a century of archaeological research, much of it done in the early 20th century. Archaeologists in these regions have a sense they sorted out enough of the details to move to the big picture. Our region is being fit into that synthesis in particular ways. As I said a few minutes ago, in recent years I've been fortunate to be a part of a collaborative team involving UMB, provincial archaeologists, and Metapanauga Heritage Park. Part of what we're doing involves exploring the archaeological past of this region through a detailed exploration of particular archaeological sites and assemblages, and especially the Augustine Mound site. As we have started moving towards continuing the research on this important site, we've been sort of talking about it in archaeological circles. And recently at a conference, I was talking, or actually it was at a field setting, I was talking with a colleague, and we were sort of mulling over sort of the import of some of these regional syntheses and how this is starting to develop in a way that is trying to fit what's happening in this region into these broader models. And I sort of said, well, you know, it's interesting because there's so many challenging ways of thinking about this. And he said, well, I don't think it's actually that complicated. I mean, you know, you have all these things that are happening down in the Midwest where there were a lot of people and there were all sorts of long-term developments. It's pretty clear that, you know, that what was happening here was sort of a reflection of what was going on down there. These comments really stuck in my mind and have troubled me ever since. So what is this archaeological synthesis, and how are we being fit in? In the interest of time, I'm going to try and boil the story down to its simplest. At a point in time around 4,500 years ago, eastern North America consisted of a broad set of regions that differed in terms of ecology and physical structure. In all of these various regions, there were people participating in a vast array of local cultural traditions that had developed over thousands of years. By 4,000 years ago, archaeological evidence suggests that these local groups began to interact with each other and trading goods and raw materials in low-level trading networks, and as a result, integrating themselves into collective identities that involve shared cultural practices and what some have described as a sharing of ideological systems. Through time, this collective ideology became expressed through the marking of significant places with earthenworks and earthen mounds, often containing burials. Following the conventions of early 20th century archaeology, excuse me, local patterns were described as types and named according to a type site. What we see here is an example of an earthen mound that is being linked to the Adena culture, an archaeological manifestation from between 800 BC and 100 AD, named after a site on the estate of a 19th century Ohio governor. So this is the Miamisburg Mound in Montgomery County, Ohio. It's in a painting that was painted in the mid-19th century by an artist named Charles Sullivan. And the, can you see my mouse there so I don't have to walk over? And this is the actual mound here. So this is an earthen construction that dates to around 2,500 years ago. Although there's a deep local history in each part of North America, we do tend to see this persistent evidence of regional integration beginning around 4,000 years ago. This is manifested in circulation of particular raw materials, and this is an example of an artifact that is made of a quartzite from northern Labrador, a place called Rama Bay. And this kind of material shows up on archaeological sites around 4,000 years ago, all the way down into New England, as well as the distribution of artifact forms. This is a stone bowl made out of steatite, and also the appearance of ceremonial mounds in the American Southeast. In the period between 4,000 and 2,500 years ago, there's no single macro-regional identity or culture that appears to be leading or stimulating these developments. These traditions are informally and loosely integrated and retain a great deal of local variability. In the period after 3,000 years ago, there's a broad shift that occurs across eastern North America that is accompanied by the development of pottery-making traditions, a general settling down on the landscape that may have been accompanied in some places by a shift away from hunting and gathering wild animals and plants towards cultivation of indigenous seeds, including species of sunflower and goosefoot, and intensive nut collecting. Although there's a lot of debate about timing, shortly after this shift, the nebulous set of ideologies and informal networks that had characterized earlier periods became formalized into a regional identity that becomes expressed as a set of coherent practices and tool-making strategies in the Ohio River drainage, itself a major tributary of the upper Mississippi. This is the phenomena that we refer to as Adena. This phenomena is characterized by the construction of earthen mounds and tool production, such as we see here, and tool production that focuses on broad-bladed flakestone tools, such as these, very sophisticated technologies for producing stone tools from grinding, fire clay and slate, such as these objects on the bottom, and a formalized iconography that shows up on objects such as this tablet. This is a stone tablet that archaeologists in this region believe was for stamping things. So it may have been for stamping pottery or cloth or even for body ornamentation, so stamping body. A key trait of Adena is a broad interest in and value for copper, which appears as both tools and in ornamental forms, such as beads and rings. Most archaeologists working in the Ohio Valley consider it to be a manifestation that develops out of local archaic practices. Some of the materials that are used for making Adena tools are not found in the Ohio Valley, especially the copper, and it is assumed that the presence of such materials indicates the continuation and expansion of regional exchange systems. Archaeologists, again, at least in Ohio, use the term Adena to denote a number of things. Sometimes they use it to refer to a people who lived in the region and who occupied scattered hamlets and developed an economy based on both wild and cultivated foods. They use it to refer to a suite of tool forms and styles expressed in material culture. And finally, they also use it to describe an ideological system that appears to have involved monumental structures, shamanism, as indicated by complex interactions between people and animals that are manifested in archaeological sites, and the smoking of tobacco. Thank you. To my mind, one of the key aspects of Adena is that the ideas and practices that it represents developed, expanded, and spread through time. Early to mid-20th century archaeologists in the Midwest, when it came to patterns and cultural manifestations, tended to be splitters rather than lumpers. As a consequence, they identified the material from the upper Mississippi after 2,000 years ago as something different, which, based on a type site in Chillicothe, Ohio, they called Hopewell. Initial explanations suggested that it originated in Indiana or New York State and involved a migration into Ohio and the co-opting of earlier Adena practices. But in more recent years, archaeologists have tended to view Adena as developing directly into Hopewell, which became sort of like a larger macro-regional cultural expression out of a broad set of shared ideas. Many consider Hopewell to be more of an exchange system than a culture per se that functions to link a set of local cultural groups into what we call the Hopewell interaction sphere. And so here you see this is a kind of map that is created to sort of designate these sort of separate cultures that can be sort of integrated into this larger whole. Over this broad region, there are a number of shared practices and manifestations that reflect the continuation and expansion of the traits of Adena, including construction of earthen mounds. And here we have actually, these are the serpent mounds, and you can see that this is an effigy mound of a snake swallowing an egg, very, very large structure. The use and exchange of exotic trade goods, a continued interest in copper, and elaborate iconography. Here we have a copper two-headed salamander, and this is a hand made out of a sheet of mica. In most parts of the system, there was a shift towards semi-permanent and permanent settlement in larger communities, and the addition of maize or corn and beans agriculture to the pre-existing practice of squash horticulture. By around 1500 years ago, there was a decrease in the volume of traded goods, leading some to suggest a decline in the Hopewell interaction sphere. However, by 1200 years ago, a new phenomenon appeared that involved a shift to even larger communities, now often fortified with ditches and palisades. This new manifestation was also regional in scale and is most strongly evident in the Mississippi drainage, and in particular along its main stem. Unlike Adena and Hopewell, this phenomena is not identified by a type site, but rather by its actual regionalness. It's called the Mississippian. It is also suggested that it originated in the southern portions of the Mississippi and spread north. Mississippians continued the practice of constructing monumental architecture, including large, truncated pyramid mounds or platform mounds, such as you see here, with structures on their top. They also are, these practices have been linked to the growth of complex social structures involving chiefly power and social inequality. The basis of the economy was apparently intensive maize or corn agriculture, and there's evidence for craft specialization and formalized economic trade. These trade networks likely brought them into contact with their neighbors to the south, where highly urbanized, massively populated city-states had developed in Mesoamerica. And you can see here, this is a shell artifact that has a piece of iconography on it that is very Mesoamerican looking. There's evidence of a hierarchy of settlements in this period, with large urban centers surrounded by small farmlands and villages. One of the largest of these urban centers was Cahokia, and this is an artist's rendition of Cahokia, both of these images are, located on the Mississippi east of St. Louis, Missouri. 2,200 acres in size, almost 9 square kilometers. This site included 120 humanly built earthenwork mounds with a population in the period between 1,000 and 800 years ago of around 20,000 people. So what we have here is a complex but generally straightforward narrative. Local developments, increasing integration, supported by economies that become more intensive over time, leading to consolidation, stratification, and complexity. Well, what about New Brunswick? We don't even make it onto most of these maps. Nonetheless, these manifestations, and in particular the Adena-Hopewell phenomena, are evident in both the larger Northeast and in New Brunswick in particular. Indeed, the Augustine Mound is just one such site. Unlike sites in the Adena heartland, most of the sites in the Canadian Maritimes have come to light only recently, at least compared to the sites in the Ohio River Valley. Most of them are unpublished, underpublished, and or in a state of analysis leading to publication. This, however, has not prevented them from being co-opted into the narrative. Indeed, the narrative is so powerful that we can use it to predict what we might actually expect to find on sites like Augustine Mound. Based on this sort of description of this very, very complex set of developments in the Mississippi, we might expect that the Adena hinterland, if we want to call it that, might have sites that are temporally limited or later copies of what we find in the core, simpler and poorer, and somehow marginal, and the recipients of culture, not the source or donor. Well, it so happens that actually some of this is reflected in the ways in which we tend to think about sites outside of the Adena core in this period. This is a plate from the Historical Atlas of Canada. And what we can see here is, this is using 1950s terminology to describe Adena, which at the time was called a burial cult. We can see major cult spread from the south, which is reflected by this red area here. This is the spread of Adena. Its diffusion into Canada. What's also, there's a couple of other interesting things I want to draw attention to, which we'll come back to. Oh, by the way, this is Augustine Mound, and the other site is actually McKinley, which is a site that was discovered by the British Museum in the 19th century. It was sort of lost to archaeological reckoning until it was rediscovered by Dr. Christopher Turnbull when he was doing some of the research related to this project. So these sites, you can see how these are sort of, this contains a lot of information. What we see here is copper deposits on Lake Superior, and the copper is flowing down into the Adena heartland down here. And then finished goods are flowing back out and into the peripheries. So we have materials flowing to the core, being shaped into Adena forms, and then flowing back out to the edges. This is another place where I've found some of this narrative reflected in terms of interpreting sites like the Augustine Mound. This is specifically about the Augustine Mound. This is a page that you can no longer actually find in the Canadian Museum of Canada's website, but it was there until last year. This describes the Adena mystery. I won't read the whole thing to you, but there are a couple of salient characteristics. This describes the recent... Oh, it's too small for me to read on my screen. The development of indigenous populations in the Maritimes contains one exciting departure. That's how this begins. It then goes on to say that the Augustine Mound is this exciting departure in that it dates it to a very limited period between 23 and 2400 years ago. It describes it as a culture not originating in the Maritimes, so it's something that's imposed from outside. It describes the copper beads in particular, which it says come from Lake Michigan or Lake Superior region. So it describes these goods as being exotic. And then it goes on to say, the Adena themselves disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. So it's a very mysterious thing in both its appearance and disappearance. And I find this quite troubling. I find it troubling in a number of ways. Anytime somebody uses a mystery to explain something, I have a problem. Mysteries don't make great explanations. It also is a little bit troubling because it doesn't feel to me the way archaeological cultures tend to work. Finally, I happen to know that a lot of this interpretation isn't based on published evidence or even unpublished evidence. So if it's not based on actual evidence, why is it a compelling narrative? So the story so far represents a boiling down, in part on my part, but also in part on the way that we tend to generate these kinds of syntheses, of a lot of complex, local, and often contradictory information. And really, this is a part of the process of how we construct syntheses, but I think it's also a way in which we seek to order information in ways that make sense to us. As I suggested earlier, the process of sorting out and seeing patterns in things can be influenced by our perception. When we take complexity and simplify it into a narrative, we often seek powerful metaphors to help us to evoke the complex whole. The fact that we tend to lose hold of metaphors and allow them to naturalize, to gain their own internal logic and meaning, similar to the way that literary metaphors become cliches and through this gain meaning independent of the original metaphor, this is a phenomena that we should be vigilant about. This is because some of the metaphors that we use in the social sciences are very powerful and have implications that, as they become cliches, we tend to ignore. The gravity metaphor, this as I call it, the term that I made up to describe this, suggests we tend to view spatial phenomena as having a directionality that's focused on its center. The progress metaphor, not one that I made up, suggests that a similar process occurs with temporal phenomena, such that they have a trajectory or a unidirectional pathway, usually constructed as up. I'm going to isolate these two metaphors in particular, although there are lots, of course, that we could talk about. We could probably find lots of examples of gravity metaphors in action, but I'm going to focus on core periphery models. Progress metaphors are equally rampant, and it's perhaps easiest to see them in the kind of social evolution models that have also been called orthogenetic models. Core periphery models have been around for a long time, but became formalized in Immanuel Wallerstein's work on world systems theory. This view suggests that the modern world is a vast interconnected system that is inherently structurally unequal. The core has a high level of technological development and is the locus of manufacturing and production, while the peripheries provide raw material and cheap labor. And so we can find lots of examples of this kind of a way of thinking about space. This is an example from China, where you have the sort of more developed core and the underdeveloped peripheries as a way of sort of mapping the economy of China. This is a similar example from Europe, where you have the Western European core surrounded by orbits of underdevelopment. By describing this as an example of a gravity metaphor, I'm not intending to critique Wallerstein or his analysis. He was attempting to understand the development of the modern capitalist world from its Western feudal core. I think that the idea of cores and peripheries is powerful and transcends Wallerstein's specific application of it. The progress metaphor is even more challenging. Many of us forget that back in the 19th century, when Darwin began to ruminate on the origins of species, there were many concepts of evolution floating around in the public and academic consciousness. One of them was the concept of progressive unilineal change through time, what some have called orthogenesis, or progressive evolution. This view suggests that evolution is a pathway towards increasing complexity, or more problematically, an intrinsic drive towards perfection. The latter variant of this view suggests that evolution has a goal or destination, and that evolutionary processes were not governed by undirected selection, but rather by a mysterious compulsion. These views have become firmly entrenched in our collective imaginations, despite the fact that biological evolutionists largely rejected orthogenesis by the 1950s. I think that in part this is because this view is not biological at all, but rather a perspective from the present looking back. When you know the end point of a trip, the destination looms large in your mind. It has been a particularly difficult concept for us to get rid of when it comes to understanding human cultural change through time. And you can see this is actually manifested in some of these graphs. This is a graph that maps time on this axis and small to large on this axis, and the wiggling line passes through various stages of social organization, from chiefdoms to states and on upward. I should say that this particular perspective on human cultural change has also been a source of conflict and contention within archaeology and anthropology for much of the last 100 years. What unites these is that they are both metaphors of difference and inequality. They are metaphors of the post-colonial era. One explains spatial inequality, the other temporal inequality or developmental inequality. The danger is they may cause us to see inequality in spatial and temporal data where none exists. The Adina Hopewell narrative encompasses both the gravity metaphor and the orthogenetic metaphor. So the narrative, as I've described it, sees a gradual process through time of increasing complexity, increasing integration of larger and larger scales of social groups. It sees there being an intensification of the extraction of resources. So people are spending more and more time getting more and more resources to support larger and larger populations. And we can see that this is accompanied by changes in technology. This is a sort of a grand narrative that actually gets repeated in many regions around the world. It's not one that's unique to the Hopewell-Adina narrative, but I think it's important to think of it in those terms, because the fact is that the evidence has been quietly accumulating in a matter that challenges many aspects of this narrative. One of the things that we have to remember is that the narrative really grew out of the period before the 1950s. And since the 1950s, there's been a lot of work that's gone on in the broader Northeast. A lot of the work that was done prior to the 1950s actually happened during the Depression in the States. During this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with this great idea of stimulus spending as a way of dealing with a depression. And the ideal project, as far as the government of the time, to spend that kind of stimulus dollars on was an archaeological project, because there were no goods that were being produced that could compete with goods in the economy. And it was a way of creating a lot of labor, employing a lot of labor. So there was a lot of work that was done in the United States in the period of the American Depression. And so we have to remember that a lot of this was based on that kind of biasing collection of information. And in the years since, what we've discovered is that in some ways that was a bias sampling, that people were picking the highly visible sites on the landscape to do these large monumental research projects on, and not necessarily trying to collect systematically research-based information as a part of building an understanding. The broader regional view suggests that the original divisions between Adena and Hopewell were driven by earlier perspectives and less by data. Viewed this way, we can see this phenomena at a much larger scale and in a much more complex fashion. For the remainder of my talk, I'll discuss how some of these elements of the narrative are under attack from the margins and speculate on some of the implications and possibilities. The modern-day community of Metapanaya is located in the Miramichi drainage at the head of tide in the confluence of the northwest and little southwest Miramichi. This community is endowed with a rich archaeological heritage, with many sites revealing a deep and profound connection to place through time. In 1972, a local resident and elder named Joseph Augustine was reminded of a place that had been shown to him by his father, who told him it was a place where the ancestors used to dance. He was concerned about the place due to local developments in the area and was curious about the site. That contained a rich array of artifacts, including flaked and ground stone tools of Adena form, qualities of copper, the largest and best preserved assemblage of perishable fiber artifacts, woven bags, baskets, and cloth, from eastern Canada, and indeed one of the best from eastern North America. Joe Augustine took his finds to the provincial government, where Dr. Chris Turnbull, the new provincial archaeologist, was astounded by what he saw. Over the next few years, a remarkable collaboration between provincial archaeologists and community members grew. Very early on, this collaborative approach shifted the project away from academic perspectives and towards community goals, including the development of community research capacity and infrastructure for the management of community archaeological resources. As a part of this program, there has been a long-term gradual approach to the research process, which is ongoing. Nonetheless, the importance of the site has led to the integration of first impressions that were published in very preliminary reports into the regional synthesis. This interpretation is that the site reflects a single event involving exotic and essentially Adena materials imported into the Maritimes from the south as a package. Now, the site did produce an astounding array of flaked stone tools, such as these objects that we call points, or bifacial, stemmed bifaces. These are large, thin, flake stone tools, tools made by chipping, that have on their base an area for hafting to a handle, as you would with a knife or a spearhead. Many are made from materials that are not from this region. These are all non-local materials, many of which do appear to originate from the American Midwest, as does this very beautiful piece here. This appears to be from a chert from down in the Ohio Valley. And many are made with great skill and artistry, as this one suggests. This is actually a geode that was a natural feature of the rock, and when the person was who made the tool was making it, they found this and recognized it and beautifully integrated it into a perfect whole. Some materials were clearly brought to the region as finished objects. 21 of the 64 stemmed points have what we have called pocket polish on them. And you can see this, there's a shiny area on this surface, on the upper raised ridges of this artifact. This is where, not from use, but from it being carried around or kept in a sort of a bag or with cloth. On the other hand, those who have used information from the site in regional syntheses tend to play up these exotic elements and downplay the importance of local materials and the presence of everyday local objects, such as chipped and ground stone celts, such as this, scraping tools, tool-making debris, and what is the most common material found on local sites, this local variant of quartz. It's an interesting observation that we know all about the distribution of Ohio materials in maritime sites, but it's very difficult to get a handle on the presence of maritime materials in Ohio sites. Now, the site contained large quantities of copper, most of which occurred as crimped copper beads. And you can see these are crimped copper beads that are crimped on leather thongs to create long strings of beads. There are over 1,400 of these crimped copper beads, as well as copper points, rings, and rods. This volume of copper is remarkable for several reasons. Firstly, just in terms of sheer volume, it's interesting. In the early contact period, copper was highly prized by native North Americans who valued it over gold for its reddish color. This mass of copper represents great wealth. Copper working in North America at this time involved cold hammering copper nuggets, and this reflects a significant investment in time and access to copper. Finally, copper, when it corrodes, produces copper salts. These are toxic to microbes and the kind of soil fauna which would normally destroy organic materials placed in an archaeological site, such as anything made of wood or animal or plant fibers. In effect, in large quantities, copper can act as a preservative. And you can see here that there is this basketry and animal pelt that's sort of being preserved by the presence of these copper. Also, this is a copper point, and you can see that it still has a haft element attached to it, and this is preserved because of the copper. This preservation of materials has opened a whole new window onto pre-contact technology in the Northeast. For example, the site produced a number of finely made groundstone implements such as this ground slate gorget. A gorget is a word that archaeologists made up to describe this. We really have no idea what it was originally called, and for the longest time we had no idea what it was for. The word gorget actually comes from military armor. It's a piece of armor that was originally worn around the neck and later became sort of ceremonial flashing around the neck. So the idea that these were sort of neck ornaments, right? And so they have been very enigmatic. At the Augustine Mound, we actually have one that's still got a handle attached. This is the first example in eastern North America of such a thing. And this has suggested to us that gorgets were actually a part of a counterweight system for a spear thrower. This is a very sophisticated technology that could have been used for very effective hunting of large game. For example, the champion throw, people actually still use these spear throwers. They're called atlatls, which is the Nahuatl term from Mesoamerica. But they still use them in various settings, often just to sort of recreate past technologies. But the world champion throw for this is 250 meters. That's a quarter of a kilometer. So this is a system that could be used to throw projectiles great distances. The conquistadors were terrified of these weapons because, used properly, they could pierce plate armor. So, as I mentioned, the copper caused there to be the preservation of organic materials that we never normally get a chance to see. And these are simply fabulous. The stereotype that we have of everybody wearing buckskin should at this point be firmly dispelled from your mind. And people probably did wear buckskin, but they also could wear beautifully woven, finely made objects that took a great deal of skill and craft to produce. We find moose hair tassels. This is a woven belt made of bison hair. We see baskets. There was a long-held idea that ash splint basketry, so important to people in this region today, was developed in the contact period. This is not the case. This has a very ancient history in this region. And we can see this is an example of a splint basket here containing copper beads. The imposition of the narrative on the Augustine mound results in the ideas that have been difficult for us to dispel. As we saw earlier, a narrative about the Adena hinterland has emerged, which suggests that its sites are later copies of core area sites and practices. And I would call this a narrative of succession or inferiority. Simplified variants of manifestations in the core, a narrative of a kind of poverty. And recipients of materials and goods from the core, a narrative of isolation and marginality. Now, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand, beginning this sort of research in detail in the Augustine Mound, to try and understand a number of the issues that relate to these narratives. For example, one of the things that we've done is we've been trying to date the site to figure out how old it is. So we've run a series of, I don't know, there's over a dozen dates there on 7 different features from the site. And what we've discovered, this is how we archaeologists tend to look at radiocarbon dates, because radiocarbon dates, frustratingly, are statistical estimates of the age. They don't tell you the actual age. They give you a statistical ballpark that we can read as a certain likelihood that an age is within a certain range. And that's what these represent. They're not normal bell curves because they've been calibrated to account for changes in radiation, all sorts of physics. But the bottom line is what this suggests is that this period of time, and you see the time axis is down at the bottom from 1,400 years ago to 3,400 years ago. So this suggests that this date fits into is most likely within a certain time period. The darker areas are higher areas of probability. Based on this, to summarize it all very quickly, we can see that the evidence seems to suggest that there were at least 2 and possibly 3 periods of use of the site. One of them dating to between 2330 and 2720 years ago. BP refers to years before present, which is actually in radiocarbon years before 1950 when the technique was developed. And the second period between 1970 and 2140 years before 1950, which we can translate into 20 to 190 BC and 380 to 770 BC. Interestingly, these don't follow neatly on from what we might expect as being the recipients of things. In fact, the dates from Augustine, if we don't, and this is even if we don't include the very early date, are early. Even without including that early date, we're still early compared to what's going on in the Ohio core. The later component does correspond a little bit to Hopewell, but again, it's earlier than we tend to think of Hopewell on average. We can see this reflected in these 2 episodes and possibly 3, reflected in the site growing over time. So the earlier parts of it are towards the center and the later parts are towards the outside. If we want to understand what's going on in terms of different materials over time, we can see some interesting patterns. We have materials that are imported, and then we have the same forms but in local materials. What's interesting is that the early materials aren't the exotic ones. You don't see the exotic stuff coming in and then being copied in local forms. The earliest materials are more likely to be of the local quartz than they are to be of these exotic materials. Furthermore, if we look at the different kinds of objects that are in the site, we can distinguish between some things that we never see in habitation sites, such as gorgets, and we find them in ceremonial contexts. And then we see things that do show up in habitation sites, such as debris from making stone tools and scrapers and those kinds of things. When we look at these, what we see is that the earliest part of the site is much more likely to have everyday materials. And it's not until you get into the later period that you see some of these more ceremonial materials starting to show up. So the myth of there being this sort of Adena lead that then gets copied into the core does not compare well with the evidence. This doesn't look like the culture of late copiers or imitators, nor does this look like the movement into the region of a dominant population or ideology. Instead, the people of the ancient community of Metapanhagia engaged in some elements of the Adena phenomena, whatever it was, very early on in its development, perhaps even at the beginning, and integrated it into their own lives in complex ways, rather than an initial pure expression that developed, became localized, and absorbed through time. This pattern intensified through time, suggesting that they participated in the development. The copper can inform both the narratives of poverty or lack of richness and of isolation. In terms of the copper itself, a widespread assumption has been made that it is all made of copper from the Great Lakes. Indeed, Great Lake copper deposits are very large and well known and undoubtedly were important. But there are smaller and possibly equally important copper sources scattered along the Appalachians. We now have ways of determining the source of copper by examining trace elements and comparing them with known sources. And this is something that we are planning to do in the next phase of our research. Using these techniques, we'll try and sort out some of this aspect. But in a trial assay on one of the beads, we were able to demonstrate that that bead does not come from Lake Superior, but comes from Cap d'Or in Nova Scotia. So we have the possibility now that at least some, and possibly a lot of the copper, may be a lot more complicated than our simple narrative had suggested. We can also compare the density or richness of copper on archaeological sites based on work by researchers in the Adena area, such as Greenman and Dragoo. So Greenman did a study of 26 archaeological sites, and Dragoo did a detailed study on the Cressup site. We also have a site that's being done on a series of Hopewell sites. The evidence from Ohio suggests that Adena copper was important but comparatively rare, and that it increased in use with Hopewell rather. And this has been suggested that there was an increasing richness of Hopewell people that gets expressed in sites. When we compare Hopewell and Adena, we see that this correlation isn't terribly strong, although the data is challenging due to the fact that it represents analysis from 50 years ago, and in some cases data that's relatively hard to compare. We can see some interesting patterns. So up in the upper area, we have the Adena sites, which have a density of that's fairly low. This is number of pieces per stratigraphic unit within the site, but it's comparable to what we see for Hopewell. Hopewell is not actually does not have a much greater density of copper. But when we look at the margins, what we see is something very interesting. We see that there is a 10 or 20-fold increase in the amount of copper on sites in the margin. The Boucher Cemetery is a site in Vermont that was excavated in the 70s, and the Rosencrantz site was a site excavated in the 40s and 50s and analyzed in the 60s in New Jersey. And so we can actually see that the further we get from the core, the more copper there seems to be. There's an increase in the density of copper. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the narrative of isolation. We tend to think about, I think one of the things that makes us think about core periphery is that there are big distances involved, and we tend to think, using sort of distance decay models, we tend to think that the further we have to go, the less likely it is, so therefore there's going to be a weakening effect with space in terms of the spread of a phenomena or the intensity of a trade network. And I think that's partially because we're thinking about how long it would take for us to walk to Ohio. We know that people didn't have horses or wagons drawn by horses. And so we're thinking, boy, that was a lot to carry, a long distance. But we're not thinking of this in the right way. They weren't using horses and wagons, but they had a mode of transportation that was much more sophisticated, much more technologically advanced in many ways, and was very fast when it needed to be. And that was the birch bark canoe. Part of the way that we've started to think about this is influenced by recognition that portage routes enabled people to move through space in very complicated ways in the Northeast. This is a map that was drawn by William F. Ganong that shows some of these routes. So that the basic idea is you take a canoe, you go up a river to a place where you can take your canoe out, you carry it over across a carrier or a portage into the next river, and so are able to move through space in fairly complicated ways. And what you can see is this creates a vision of space that's very interconnected and involves lots of ways and directions in which people can travel. Just to give you a sense of how effective this could be, in 1776, a bunch of British officers needed to get from Quebec City to Port Royal. they approached some Wolastoqiyik or Maliseet canoeists who took them up the St. Lawrence into the Chaudière, across the portage into the upper St. John, down the St. John, then up the Canaan, crossing over to the Petitcodiac, down the Petitcodiac to Port Royal in 7 days. So this is not isolation the way we're thinking. This is a very sophisticated technology, and one that Tapenadny, who was considered a world expert on skin and bark boats, reckoned achieved its highest state here in New Brunswick. The finest bark boats in the world were produced here by ancestral Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik and Pestamacadiac. Now, I've been trying to think of how I can... This feels to me like this is an important thing. So we want to try and figure out how this can fit us into the Ohio thing. And so I've been trying to... Well, I figured, what Ganong did was he looked at many of the traditional routes of travel to do this. So we have to be able to do this in a broader way. So I started by looking at things like, for example, this is La Salle's trip into the Mississippi. In 1669, La Salle wanted to get to India, and he figured there had to be big water over here somewhere. So he managed to talk people, he heard about this big water, that was the Mississippi, and he managed to talk people into taking him across some of their traditional pathways to try to get into the Mississippi. And in 1679, he did that, traveling all the way down, unfortunately not to India. But at the same time, showing us a very effective and probably very ancient travel route. So we can start to use this to build up these networks and look at these travel ways across the Northeast to create an understanding of space that, like our diagram of the Canadian Maritimes or of New Brunswick, is interconnected and plugged in and woven together by these vast systems of highways. What's interesting about this is it causes us to rethink the idea of a core and a periphery. What if the invention and perfection of the birch bark canoe was a key component enabling networks, mobility, and the transportation of goods? What if the people of the Canadian Maritimes were integral to these developments and further were not only able to contribute but capitalize on them? What we see here is the southern limit of paper birch or canoe birch. So this not only was a technology that developed here, but possibly was the technology that fed into this system but was available here. There are parts of this network that are much harder for us to see. And I think the lesson that we can take from a site like Augustine is never assume, because we don't see the baskets, that they weren't there. The picture that emerges from our region is one of a sophisticated, wealthy, engaged population. The notions of marginality, isolation, and poverty that are imposed on this region have not only served to limit us in terms of our understanding of the past, but have affected our abilities to create mutually respectful accounts of a collective past upon which we can proudly construct a regional identity that is not based on externally imposed limitations. Thank you.
Questions, of course?
I guess so.
Well, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank Sue for a really quite remarkable and important talk that I think makes you rethink a lot of the history of this peripheral region, both in her period and perhaps beyond. The analogies to the history of Confederation and post-Confederation and the way Canadian historians have written about that, for a historian, is quite striking, and some obvious analogies. But let me not go on in that vein. Let me turn Sue over to you, and I will ask that those of you who might want to ask a question, name yourself, and I'm going to repeat it for the record, because this is being recorded, and hence the bright lights of the camera, etc. So it will seem redundant, but it's to get it on the mic. So, questions?
It's all clear. Excellent.
Shy audience.
I have one.
When?
I visited 2 sites with you this past summer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have a sore throat. But, I don't know what the evidence is on those 2 sites yet, and I don't think the second site that we visited has been dug or like the.
Trying to remember which 2 sites. I know one was
one
a
in
Bristol.
Enfield.
Oh, yeah.
The one
Yes.
in Enfield and the one up in Bristol.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they fit into what you just mentioned, Scott?
I
So
think.
for the record, Sue, I'll just interrupt, having forgotten to do what I was supposed to do. That was Gwen Blair, the elder in residence at the University of Brunswick. Sue.
Thanks. So the question is about how other sites that aren't necessarily related to Adena and Hopewell fit into this pattern. And I think I've sort of picked the Adena Hopewell thing because it's a way in which I think we're explicitly being co-opted into these kinds of narratives. But I would argue that we can see this richness in all parts of the Maritimes and in all the kinds of sites that I've looked at. The reason why these kinds of narratives have bothered me for a long time is they didn't fit with anything I've ever seen. And so it so happens that, we've been actively working, on sort of with Metapanagia Heritage Park as a part of developing these kinds of narratives. But I think it's true that the archaeology of this region and the evidence from this region from all parts of the area show these kinds of interconnections and these kinds of ways in which this was a very dynamic, engaged region through time. So I think, that you could look at any number of time periods and different areas and find the same kinds of things.
Another question? Yes.
Gary Campbell, you were talking about your analysis of the beads on the Augustine Mound.
Yes?
Has anybody done similar research into the copper found in the Hopewell and the Adena? The Maritimes?
There's been some work that's being done, particularly on sites like the Boucher Cemetery. And in those places, what they're starting to find is that the copper is coming from it's a lot more complex than the original narrative. That it's not all coming from Lake Superior, but that actually Cap d'Or was one of the sources of copper that spread materials to the south. So it's been, it's some of the original work that was done on that. It's just come out in the last year or so. And I was talking to one of the women, Marianne Levine, who's been doing some of that work. And when she first got it, she was very uncomfortable with the results because a lot of it was statistical and she wanted definitive things. But I think as that research is developing, we're starting to see that it's enough of a pattern that for sure it's too simplistic to say it's all from Lake Superior.
Yes?
Pat Bolges.
Hi.
I'm curious in the analysis, the density of copper beads in those sites. Compared to Augustine and Boucher, were the other sites subject to more disturbance, possibly before pre-archaeological?
It's a good question. I'm finding it hard to sort of get my head around some of the Ohio sites because they're not terribly accessible. I suspect I'm going to have to do a lot of road trips to try and go down and look at things. There's a lot of stuff. Gwen and I are going on a road trip. But the copper seems to be, it does seem to be generally not as rich in copper, and that's a pattern that others have observed. Particularly researchers working in sort of the Delmarva Peninsula, so that would be considered the hinterland to the east. They've noticed that, and copper is a good example, but it's just, there's actually many other classes too, where you do see there seems to be more material on the peripheries showing up in these sites. And so it seems not likely to be preservation, although it is an excellent question because we so easily can have just a small part of the record preserved, but it does appear that that's a real phenomena. Like I say, there's a lot of things that I think we're going to have to go down and really look at the Ohio sites with a sort of that kind of view from this region, you can't tell whether there's quartz down there because they don't report it. They want to illustrate the really beautifully fine-made chert materials. Quartz is a much harder material to work. Archaeologists tend to view it as sort of a material of last resort because it is so hard to work. But it's quite possible that there's a lot of quartz that made it down there but just doesn't get reported on. So this idea that everything went from there to here, I think we need to scrutinize that in all material classes.
Yeah, in the case of the quartz, might it be that it's more utilitarian than
It certainly is possible that it didn't.
the really beautiful Ramaveh
Yeah.
compared to what are you going to use when you're...
Yeah, you've looked at enough quartz. I can tell. I was going to say quartz can be beautiful, but it is a tough material to work, and it's a very unpredictable material to work. So that's the other possibility is that. But wouldn't it be neat if there was quartz down there? That would sort of really shift your thinking. I think there's a lot of opportunity here for rethink.
Yes.
Is it possible that the increased amount of copper in the Augustine site is not so much related to the fact that it's peripheral to the more complex society, but that it's closer to the copper in Nova Scotia?
Could you identify yourself, sir?
Oh, Eric Dawson.
Thank you.
It's possible. That's one of the things that we'll have to really try and understand when we start looking at where copper's from. And I think that's a possibility. I think that this research that suggests that actually copper from this area is being disseminated into other parts of the network is also very interesting, so that it sort of changes the idea of source and recipient. I think that there's other possibilities too, and one of them is that the source at Cap d'Or tends to produce very small nuggets. So it's possible that bigger pieces were made from copper from Lake Superior, and smaller pieces were made from copper from here. But those are all going to be exciting things to try and sort out as we move ahead with the research. But I think it is overly simplistic to say that we know that it all went from the core as raw material, or from the peripheries as raw material into the core and then back out again. But whatever we discover from the copper, I think it's going to be interesting.
Hi, David Black. I wanted to ask a question to sort of follow up Pat Holter's question, and that is one of the indicators of copper would be preserved organics like fabric and plastic and things like that. And one would think that in the Ohio, like the Udina and Hopewell mounds, that stuff would be reported, even if they're not reporting materials like quartz that they think aren't important or something like that. So I was wondering, what's the status of organic artifact assemblages from those mounds?
There's two parts to that. One is there are organic artifacts that are found in those mounds. So there have been preserved organics found from those sites. The other thing that some have speculated on is that the conditions under which, particularly on sites that were excavated later, the problem is that the ones that were excavated in the 30s, preserved organics, when they're first encountered, can be very difficult to identify. They tend to look like darkened root masses. I mean, they don't. It's often very hard to see what you're looking at, and so there is a bias against sites that were excavated under those kinds of terms. But when you look at sites like Cresep and some of the Hopewell sites, for example, there's some very interesting organics that have been recovered from those sites. So it suggests that there was enough copper in them to do that, to preserve them to some extent. Does that answer that?
A last question? Perhaps from the back? Anybody back there want to get their oar in? To make that paddle?
They're paddling. Yeah.
Get your paddle in. If not, I'd like you to join me in thanking Sue for a really stimulating talk.